What's the roots of any spiritual? Who knows? You don't know the roots of a spiritual. Nobody knows. You might know a regional area, maybe North Carolina, or maybe in Georgia. You don't know. So it's just like any other folk music. It's an anonymous music. That, to me, is the miracle of what spirituals are all about. Is how could an illiterate people, not ignorant, but illiterate, come up with such magnificent melodic material? Now, a lot of musicologists around who say, oh, but they were influenced by what they heard white people doing. And of course, the original spirituals were predicated on early hymns. You're talking 18th century. Because we must remember, the conversion of blacks didn't begin until the turn of the 18th and 19th century. They were enslaved. They were considered chattel. They were not considered capable enough of being a part of a denominational group. A lot of slave owners said they didn't have any souls. They were chattel. But eventually, when the Great Awakening period came in the late 18th century, and you began to have missionaries from New England begin to go down into the South to evangelize not only whites but blacks. And of course, blacks were not allowed at that time to go into the churches or to the camp meetings in the summertime. They could stand around tent meetings. And outside, they would sing louder than the people inside. It became an obnoxious kind of thing, you know what I mean? But then they began to pick up. Because the earliest form of spiritual, I always say, is the long-metered spiritual, which is a series of undulating sounds that built on white hymns. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. Oh, for 1,000 tongues. That doesn't have meter. That is beatless music. It's a wailing kind of thing that was started by generally one individual in the circle of prayer or in the church situation. People would literally follow that long meter, that person who was leading that song, because they had no hymn books. He would line it out, and then they'd follow whatever he did with the melodic material. So I call the long meters the earliest form of the spiritual. It's taking a white text and literally following it until after a while people would say, Mr. Jones, let Mr. Jones lead that song. So it was called Mr. Jones's Piece. And he was unique because he knew what direction he was going. But those words were white. There's another one called majestic sweetness sits enthroned. Those are not black words by any stretch of the imagination. But they were the beginnings of the early spirituals in a long metered shape or form, you see. Then eventually you got the more personalized spiritual as it began to evolve. But nobody knows. Nobody knows. There were some plantations that sang better than others, and the word would spread. You know, the circuit preacher would go from, finally it was allowed to have a circuit preacher go from plantation to plantation. It was not something that was easily permitted by the slave owners. They felt, hey, there's enough intimidation here. Some of the blacks are burning down the sheds and escaping and doing all these things, you know. So we don't want somebody going from place to place carrying the propaganda of freedom. So conversion and the awakening period was met with glee or happiness by the slave owners because to quell the unrest among slaves. They would preach, God is going to make a way for you, and you're going to go to heaven, you're going to walk the golden streets, you're going to drink milk and honey, which to me is nauseating. But I mean, anyway, I just feel these are some of the aspects of the thing that began to change. And they said, look to God, you will be free someday. Not in this land, but somewhere. So that engendered a lot of imagination, like using prophets in the material of Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, and go down Moses, and Daniel, servant of the Lord. You see, these were all paraphrases of biblical material that they had heard preached by the circuit preacher or by somebody in the group who could read. See, in the big house, they had to train slaves to read because they had to keep bills of lading. They had to read recipes for masa and misa, to cook the food that they would want, a certain style of food, you see. So it's very interesting. And to train some of the slaves to play the violin, because it was very, very fashionable in the early colonial period to have a black string quartet with white powdered wigs playing Haydn quartets. How'd they learn to do that? They had to be trained, you see. So the whole thing to me is, particularly spirituals, it's just an absolute miracle. It's a phenomenon. And whenever I employ them and use them, that's why today, whenever my choir performs, I avoid the use of white arrangers. Not that I'm discriminating. I just feel there's no emotional continuity. I found one or two that I use because I think they have made a contact with the emotion of the material so that they are in tune with it. But most of spirituals that I see come by the thousands over my desk are nothing but paraphrases that are burlesques. They don't really understand how to take a beautiful melodic material and a very contemplative text and treat it with a kind of an inner emotion, you know. That's why I have some white singers in my all-black Jubilee singers. They wanted to be with me. They will go out from that choir as directors and singers of spirituals with an entirely different attitude because they've had a chance to experience it and sensitize it. And my argument is that if you're going to do Brahms or Bach or Haydn or Mendelssohn, you have to study the performance style. If you're going to do spirituals, immerse yourself in the style. Immerse yourself in it.